and welcome to episode 2 of the Living Lands podcast. I appreciate all the kind words and everyone who reached out after listening to our first episode. In a couple weeks, we will be releasing our second interview with Peter Levi, a freshwater hydrologist from Northland University. We will also be dropping YouTube content to dive deeper into the podcast topics and making them accessible to all of our audience. In this second part of the conversation with Justin Thomas, we expand on sea values and how anyone can use them to look at the world a little differently. I hope you enjoy. So prairies are something that we've talked about a lot today, and obviously you and I have talked about prairies a lot just in our previous conversations, but just for the audience that we have, talking a little bit about prairies and why prairies and what do prairies look like? What is their significance? I know that's a lot, but I really think it's important to paint the picture of like, what do prairies provide that maybe our yards or our current grasslands and fields are not providing, and then what should they be, what should they look like in the future, and why?
Well, prairies are, of course, mostly a high. Basically, I think we define prairies more the lack of trees than anything else. We think of prairies as being grasslands, but they're usually, I do a lot of work for Missouri Prairie Foundation, Missouri Department of Conservation. Johnson County Parks has prairie remnants. We collect a lot of data on them. And when you look at data like really high quality prairies, they're actually a good 50-60% forbs by biomass. So they look grassy, but there's a lot of forby herbaceous things in there that aren't necessarily grass. But they're formed because it's too dry, or it was historically too dry for trees to establish, and grasses are favored. People think fire is the driving factor in that dynamic. It is a factor. I don't know that it's a driving factor, but the prairies are a climatic phenomena. And when grasses start establishing in landscapes over long periods of time, grasses grow roots down into the soil, and then those roots periodically die and regrow and die and regrow, and they build soils. So prairies, like I said earlier, is really a soil phenomenon. Prairie builds soils, and they build a lot of carbon in soils. They're great. We're learning more and more that they're as good a carbon sinks as forests. But they build soil, and they build soil microbia. When you start damaging prairies, the microbia starts eating away the soil. And so when a prairie starts becoming a forest, or a grassland starts becoming a woodland or a forest, that really is a dynamic of the soil being eaten away by microbia, because the dynamics that created grasslands have changed.
Hi, puppy.
We got a puppy dog, Rosie. Hush.
All good. I know how
Yeah,
that feeling too well.
but
uh
but when we do restorations, the it's a different phenomenon, because we don't have that preordained soil in those landscapes. So we're, what you end up with like restorations, you end up with a lot of grass um, dominance in systems. Or if you try to, a lot of restorationists will try to put more forb seed to counteract the grass seed. You end up with really forb heavy systems. Striking that balance is really hard. Um, but ultimately, the richness and the complexity that prairies are capable of achieving is phenomenal. We've done prairies. There's prairie native intact prairies that we've done were a quarter meter, so like the size of a cushion of a seat, half a meter by half a meter square. The record, and it's a world record, literally, is 46 species of native vascular plants in that tight of an area. Now,
wow.
those 46 species are everywhere. The whole site may have only 100 species, but they're so mixed, and they're so. There's a just a little side. There's a guy in Illinois, Jack White, who does prairie stuff. He's an old natural. He helped start the natural history program in Illinois, so he's an older gentleman now. But he's currently doing these prairie cross sections and long sections where he takes a prairie plot, and he'll cut away a centimeter of stems and take a photograph, then cut another centimeter, a meter wide, and take another photograph. And what he's finding is he slowly like removes layers in a prairie plot, is how big blue stem and little blue stem will grow like this, together and leave this sort of Gothic arch in the middle. And that Gothic arch will be filled with a stiff goldenrod leaf. And then at the stiff goldenrod leaf and the big blue stem, the little corner, another smaller Gothic arch will have a violet in it. That there is a structural complexity there. In a prairie remnant or in an old field, even you make that cross sections, it's all chaotic and there's no real that depth and that structure. The attunement to place at that scale to which living systems can achieve is different than a system that has had time to sort and has all the pieces to fill those holes. So that's, in reality, I think one of the things coming out of Jack's work doing this is that our goal probably as restorationists is to start looking at ways we architecturally piece prairies back together. It's always up until this point, it's just how do we get a bunch of prairie plants to grow together. The next phase is, okay, how do we get those pieces to reassemble in their natural states to literally niche maximize those landscapes, to get more pollinators, to get more functional dynamics on landscape.
So is there like a tipping point? Like if, let's say I have a 5-acre plot and I want to turn it into the best prairie ever. So we do all this stuff. We basically burn it off, cut everything down, get rid of all the invasive species. We start over. Let's say we do that. But if we have a really good restoration plan for 100 years, and in 100 years, all those native seeds took hold and it's nice and native and the C value's off the charts, is that a prairie after 100 years? Or is it like, is there a tipping point, or does it need to be a specific size, or does it need to have a specific dynamic that without it, it is no longer a prairie? I'm just very curious about that, because at some point there has to be a line drawn, right?
Yeah. For me, I think it kind of comes down to how we ultimately define nature or natural systems is usually a place that functions on its own. So you talk about like doing a restoration, and there's lots of energy input, and it's basically just like building scaffolding and braces and training wheels and on a living landscape. The goal to make that a natural functioning system is to eventually remove all the braces and all the scaffolding and all the training wheels, and for that system to roll on functional on its own. I think that is possible. I think that takes a long time. I often joke it's the difference between a rich Gruyere, moldy, mottled, stinky, fine cheese and craft singles is two things. It's the quality and craftsmanship put into it, and the time scale to which it's allowed to manifest. I mean, you could put craft singles in a humidor for 10 years and it's not going to get much better.
Have you tried it?
I don't know. Maybe we should try to find out. There's got to be a brick of government cheese somewhere
there's a brick of McDonald's cheese somewhere that's right. Still going. Yeah, I'm sure
somewhere for sure. But and I think in living systems we're just now at the point in restoration and stuff. It's always been the question has always been, how do we reassemble these things? And as we start to get better at that, we start to realize the question isn't so much how do we put these things together, it's how do we put these things together and get them to interact. I often put, restorations often remind me of like an 8th grade school dance. You've got boys and girls together, but nobody knows what's going on. They're standing around here and over there. You don't have a dance. You're calling it a dance. Most people aren't dancing. It's just a bunch of awkward or entities put together. Nature is a rave in downtown New York City at 2 a.m. I mean, that's what a living system is. And so how do we get one to the other is a learning process. I don't know that we have that answer. I think we're now just sort of becoming aware of having to ask that question.
So is that kind of the next phase then of like the research? I mean, it's just kind of
Yeah.
figuring out like what is there a ratio of grass to forbs to trees to shrubs, and then just kind of playing onto that until we figure it out in the long term.
Yeah, and for sure, and I think the first step towards really getting into to the success of that, to those latter stages, the next stages of of restoration, whether it's woods or prairies or whatever, is understanding that this is our journey, that we as people have to change. The things that we care about have to modify as we modify the system. We start, okay, put it this way: the first prairie restorations were like CRP sort of things. Like, okay, here's much seeds together, we threw them there. Now it's a prairie. Then you realize, oh, well, that's not quite right. What about this? And you start doing this, and oh, well, that's not quite. As you keep doing things, as this becomes important, as you become engaged and start doing these things, it's changing you as well. So all of a sudden, you're becoming aware that life is a very complex and a very magical thing that depends upon order. It depends on stability. It depends on making mistakes and learning from them. I don't think we're quite conscious of our engagement in our process, but I think if we become reflective with that, and it's one thing I like about C values is it gives us a reflective lens. We start becoming reflective of our relationship and how we need to be different and how we need to perceive systems. We start realizing that our perception starts manifesting as that landscape manifests as well.
Right.
You you know the person that built the person and the attitudes that built prairie restorations 10 years ago is a very different person and a very different perspective than people that will be building prairie restorations 20 years from now.
Sure.
And the difference there is going to be a degree of compassion, a degree of understanding, a degree of involvement, because there is no recipe. And there's probably no, I mean, that's probably part of the journey is realizing, okay, what are the expectations and how, to what degree can we actually do these things? I get emails quite a bit for people asking, we've got this prairie restorations 20, 30 years old, but it still has a C value of 3.0, an average C value of 3.0, whereas a native prairie, intact high quality prairie, will have an average C value like 4.5. That's a big difference between 3 and 4.5. But they realize that the difference is that when you look at the understory, when you pull grasses back and look down at on the ground at the roots, there's still lots of weedy junk under there. Whereas a high quality prairie, you look at the understory, look under the grasses and forbs, and there's quality all the way to the ground. But nobody's collecting seeds of the little tiny things that fill the understories of prairie. So a lot of the emails and stuff I get now are sort of that new awareness, that next stage of like, oh, we didn't go deep enough into the prairie. How do we move along? I think being aware of that process and saying to ourselves, okay, what's the question we're going to ask 50 years from now? Let's ask it now. Let's cut to the chase and speed this process up. Those questions are going to be questions of how do we get things to function and relate. Probably a lot of soil microbia dynamics that we haven't really considered, because even on the best prairie restorations, when they go in and do like bee surveys, they're still very generalist bees. You go to a prairie remnant, even like right next door, and there are bees. First of all, there's 3 times as many species, and the 2/3 that are greater on the prairie remnant are species that live their lives in a 5 square meter and they never leave it. How do you get that dynamic on a restoration?
So you said something there that I want to make sure people hear, and you said something that really struck me as well. A prairie, a high quality prairie, average C value is 4.5. That seems pretty low, right? I mean, in the grand scheme of things, on a 0 to 10 scale.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point, and it's a question people often have are why isn't the average C value in the sevens or the eights? And the short answer to that is that a functional living system needs zeros, ones, and twos, and it needs sevens, eights, nines, and tens. And when you average those, like if you go into a prairie, an intact old growth prairie system, it's about 20% big blue stem or little blue stem, and that's the backbone of the matrix of the prairie that creates the general structure to which other things occur. And then there's long-lived perennials that take up another 30-40%. Long-lived forbs and perennials. Um, that system to be functional, to be to work over long periods of time needs that depth of a toolbox, that 0 to 10. It needs a little bit of all of it, but it needs a little bit higher in the middle because things do happen. There are, tip up mounds, or a bison will wallow out of spots, and there's an ecological answer to those. So it's not that you don't need any low C values, because you do need some. It's the proportion to which you need, and ultimately that proportion is what drives that C value. So the highest C value I've ever seen, the highest average C value of an intact living system that I've ever seen, it was a legitimate sort of number, is about 6. And when you start getting high C values in the 6 range, you start asking, okay, are there species on this list whose individual C values may be too high? Do we need to go back to the list and change some numbers, calcareous fin communities, these seepy wet groundwater wet systems in the Ozarks? They'll have high C values, but a lot of those plants are, because we've inflated the numbers a little bit. But that number 4.5 is pretty much the litmus test for high quality functional system. 3.5, this is written into most of the literature. 3.5 average C value, 3.5 or higher is a site that has restoration potential. You get below an average C value of 3, you're talking about putting in a lot of energy and a lot of effort to fix an old beat up fescue field, with some weedy natives and things that are in it. It'll have an average C value of 2. So these are very subtle changes. But yeah, good systems average out about 4.5, maybe a little higher sometimes.
So I want to touch on one thing you just said before I ask a question that's totally going to take us on something else. But you talk about changing the C values, like who gets that jurisdiction, and if it's that simple to just go back and say, all right, well, maybe we rated this one too high 10 years ago, let's change it up. It's like, then, doesn't that raise somewhat of a question of like, well, how legitimate are these values? And, how hard is it, or how simple is it to actually change these values? And then furthermore, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I alluded to this a while ago, that they're numbers, and that's misleading because this is not a numerical metric. So we're using numbers as more or less categorical data. Like statisticians hate the C value system because we're using numbers in the way that you would use shades of color. It's not really a numerical value, but it makes sense. Whatever it is, it work. We always tell statisticians to try to work on it, and they'll agree. They usually agree over time. Is that it should not really work mathematically, but it does. So they're a qualitative measure, and it is subjectively assigned. What happens is a group of botanists say tall goldenrod, Solidago altissima. What do you guys think? The numbers used to be sort of a way of thinking about what to assign them, is the chances out of 10 that you'd find it in an intact high quality system. So tall goldenrod, you'd look at it and you'd say, well, it's in quality systems, but it's not common. 1 or 2. And so a group of botanists pitch numbers, try to defend their numbers, and then eventually derive at a consensus of what that number should be for each species. And then the keepers of the list, me, Doug Ladd, a couple other folks, we're constantly making notes and curating notes of like, okay, that's a little high, that's a little low. We're still trying to zero in on these numbers to make them a little more functional. But then there are some species that are very, it's difficult because some species are don't quite fit the goal or fit the concept. Like there's these false foxglove, the genus Agalinus. They're these hemiparasitic, annual, often um, forbs that occur in really high quality woodlands, but they only really express from the seed bank if you do something really dramatic and shocking them. Like if you burn too much, or sort of do some thinning a little much, things that are sort of antithetical to the actual system, they will express. Um, However, in beat up woods, they won't exist and they won't persist. So there are these sort of things that react to damage but aren't an indicator of a damaged system. Those are hard to give C values to because they're kind of bimodal. But so yeah, then once we accumulate, in all honesty, 37 states now have the C value system, and several regions have the C value system. Of those, most of them have maybe a third of them have ever been updated. Missouri, again, the first list was 93 for Missouri. It was updated for the first time in 2015, but we're already talking about redoing it, in the next couple of years. So there's a little quicker turnaround. Kansas has numbers. I think Kansas got numbers for the first time 4 or 5 years ago. Arkansas is just about to publish their numbers, but usually committees determine individually what those numbers should be. And it's all based on experience. And that's just the thing. That's why it's called an ecological checklist and has those C values in it, because you got to deal with the taxonomic names that may not come from field-based knowledge primarily, but the numbers have to come from an experiential relationship with the landscape. There's been studies in Illinois where they defend it statistically, where they say, okay, if there's these great papers by Matthews in Illinois, and Greg Spirius at Champaign Urbana does cool research where they take, like, okay, if they take real data, real quadrat plot data across landscapes, and they say if something has a 7, then there should be sixes and eights that occur with a 7 statistically. You shouldn't have a 7 and an 8 in a plot that also has a bunch of zeros and ones. And so they test that statistically to determine how predictable those numbers are, and they're very, very solid statistically from testing it from that standpoint, um, which is wonderful.
So, how did Missouri's floristic quality assessment become such a standard and high quality setup? Because I've talked to people in Iowa, and people seem to look at the Missouri assessment that you worked on as kind of like a golden example of what every state should have but doesn't have, or will hopefully have in the future. Not that ours is perfect, but something to strive towards, because we actually do have a pretty strong basis for going outside in Missouri and looking at the C values and seeing what we have. Conversely, I go over the border 5 minutes away and I'm in Kansas, and the floristic quality assessment of Kansas is on a completely different level. Not that it's bad, but it doesn't meet maybe necessarily the standard that we have for the Missouri one.
Yeah, I think there's two things there. One is Missouri, whether it's Missouri Botanical Gardens influence, or just the right people at the right time in the night. When environmental movements express themselves in the formation of new state parks and new opportunities through the Missouri Department of Conservation and things like that in the 70s and 80s, natural history programs, natural heritage programs were not a thing until the 70s and 80s. Missouri and Illinois happened to just be two states that had a lot of political muscle behind them. And so Missouri's always had a really strong conservation community, and even, usually in the form of hunting and fishing, which are good things. but also in a natural history sense and a natural resource sense and an awareness of what ecological functions and systems are. So we've had great people, Paul Nelson, Doug Ladd, the Bruce Shooties, Bruce Shooty, the Bruce Shooties, Bruce Shooty, lots of people at parks, Dan Dries, and Illinois had a lot of wonderful people too. But Missouri has a lot of landscapes. So I think we've just had the right political climates and and inertia from that to develop early notions of functional systems. Um, Also, the landscape itself. So Missouri has lots of intact systems, at least the southern half of it. The Ozarks are one of the most intact landscapes in eastern North America. And so we have a lot of examples in there. Because we have a lot of examples, we have a lot of experience. And because we have a lot of experience, we can better assign C values. And you know, the first step of C values is first saying what are the species. So you have a taxonomic platform as well. Whereas somewhere like Iowa, which, you know, I love Iowa. There's lots of wonderful places in Iowa. It's a beautiful state, despite the fact that most of it has been completely altered. I mean, it's almost a mechanized landscape at this point. It would be hard to assign C values simply because you don't have numbers to see it. In the like Chicago area, one of the you know, Chicago region was the birthplace of fluorescent quality assessment. Um, Most people that work somewhere else that go to Chicago and look at their numbers quickly realize that their numbers are higher than anywhere else. And it's probably because in the Chicago region there's nothing really left, and what remnants they do have are really special. And so the numbers are kind of, you know, you say they're artificially inflated, but they may or that may or may not be fair. But a but like a C value, me an average C value prairie in like the Chicago region using their numbers of 4.5 would probably score like 3.5 in Missouri.
So I know you're gonna hate this, but as much as there are statistical basis for a lot of this stuff, and there's science to kind of support it, there is almost in a way an art to knowing what should be somewhere, and it comes from a experience. It comes from seeing it. It comes from going places where it should be and not seeing it, and just kind of
Yeah,
corroborating all that information and just being like, hey, this needs to be out there, and I know it for a fact in my soul, but I have nothing that can really confirm or deny it either.
yeah. There's a book called Grasslands. It's a popular prairie awareness sort of book. I forget the author, but in there the author refers to botanists as these shaman like characters that just feel they step out of a car onto a piece of property and they can just innately sense by the structure and a few plants they see what that landscape is. As a botanist, I can do that. I do feel that. I think I think it's a human thing. I think of being a, you know, knowing plants, being trained or self trained in the landscape allows you to start justifying that and seeing what those values actually mean and what they are. But I think it's a very human thing, and it's kind of the beauty and it's what C values are. It's mean C or the FQA process, mean C values, first quality assessment. It really is a tool to try to just give the average person access to that shamanistic awareness of what a functional landscape is. Largely for me, to the hope that will touch something in their souls that make them realize that this is a deeply human process of reading landscapes and engaging in landscapes healthfully. I don't think we need them. I mean, it would be nice if we just didn't have to have C values. If people just knew that, because ultimately, if you had to get rid of C values in the Flips quality assessment protocol, I would just tell people whatever it takes to stabilize the functional dynamics of a landscape are ultimately the good of that landscape. And so, whatever it takes to create structure and function, I mean, it is whatever it is about life. Life just tends to Life left to its own devices without damage, without alteration, over time complexifies and intensifies and becomes magical in and of itself. It is a quality of life itself. We don't have to make, it's not like these are Legos and we're building systems. I think that mentality gets you nowhere. But these are living systems that must engage with themselves, and they do engage with themselves because it is the very foundation. It is the definition of a living system.
But
It's the
there's nothing
additive.
inherently wrong with humans coming in and modifying it because, for example, like a field border in a row crop field, there's no way that that border is ever going to have a natural uh, evolution to a nice grassland prairie if you don't plant it with something. If you don't put seed there, the chances of that ever colonizing to something meaningful in the long term is so low because those plants likely aren't even in the immediate vicinity, let alone miles away even, or there's a chance that that's a very high chance that that's the case. And so human intervention is critical, yet in an unfortunate way because it shouldn't have gotten to this point, but it did. We're here, and we need to, or we should at least, consider what we have to do at least to
Yeah,
try and get it to something else.
I agree 100% with that and what you're saying. The one thing that I don't necessarily like about that, and maybe this is where you were trepidatious with it to begin with, is is how much when you say that, and I do the same thing. I'm not picking on you. How much we hold back and say, well, we have to, you know, humans do this and we're going to be involved in that, and there's almost an apologetic sort of relationship. We really have to get over that and realize we are part of this landscape, and that this is how we engage with it. This is a healthy thing, like you're saying, putting in a border in next to a crop field that's going to help stabilize that system and bring in some functionality and bring in some biological diversity in that thing. That's a beautiful process. Yeah, it's not what was there 100 years ago. It's not nature in and of itself, but it is living things engaging with living things, and that we are one of those things engaging with. It's we got to get off of this notion of like, um, our engagement in nature is somehow artificial, because it isn't. And the concept that it is artificial is most of the problem.
So I think most of the so you're absolutely right, and that's kind of the point I was trying to make. Is it's like um, a lot of people, like we talked about at the very beginning of this episode, is that they see the green screen, they have no idea what plant is what, and they don't care. Some of these people, they might download the floristic quality assessment and go outside and look at the C values of these different plants, and it almost seems like really negative at first because you realize that a lot of the stuff you're seeing is zeros. They're actually invasive. This should not be here. Ones or twos. It's like, okay, we're starting somewhere, but it's I want to see nines and tens. I want to see all these rare plants, and I want to see them thrive and stuff like that. But then you start to realize that it got that way for a reason. Those plants aren't here for a reason anymore, and our you know process of taking this 0, 1, and 2 system and even making it a 4, 5, and 6 system, or just even adding 4s, 5s, and 6s to that system, although it isn't natural, or they aren't getting there naturally because we are coming in, we are recognizing a mistake that we made, whether intentional or not, and we are saying we are making a conscious and intentional effort to preserve and maintain and improve the land. And I think that intentionality is important because it's not going to do it naturally unless we just evacuate. And even then, it's still probably not going to with how deep we are in the whole thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's part of that engagement. And like you say, people when they first start looking at sea values will realize how crappy most of the landscape they have is. Although Leopold referred to an ecologist living in a world of wounds, when you start becoming aware, you start realizing just how beat up and bruised a landscape is. But Robin Wall Kimmerer, braiding sweetgrass, in the last couple of years, has kind of flipped the script in the way that she says it may be a world of wounds, but it's still the world that's feeding us, that's providing us oxygen. So engaging it engaging it in a way that you know you're going to do it wrong, but knowing that you're going to do it wrong helps you learn to start doing it right. So there's that whole, like, nobody, what do they call it, the, like, there's a, like, a starting something phobia. There's a term for it. You don't want to start, you don't want to engage in something because you're going to do it wrong. You have to realize, yeah, you're going to do it wrong, but that's how you start to do it right. And so I think we often don't launch in on things like this because we think, oh, it's nature and it's precious, and we may mess something up. As long as you're aware that you may mess something up, you're probably ultimately going to learn and do it better. The managers that I fear the most are the ones that think they know how to do it all. Oh no, here's how we do it all right. You go in here and you do this, do that. They usually end up with pretty abused landscapes. I mean, it literally is the intentionality with which you engage in something, whether it's parenting children or running your business or engaging with living systems. It's another one of these phenomenal dynamics of just life itself. Is the intentions you have and the worries that you have ultimately determine how the product is, but there's got to be action. And if you're not taking action, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not going out and doing anything, and this does not only apply to plants, but if you're just not doing anything, you're letting the system do the work, but it's being affected by you regardless of if you intended to or not, and other people as well. And so by even going out on your daily walk and looking at one new plant on your daily walk every single day, you'd be surprised in 2 weeks you're not finding any new plants on your daily walks anymore. You've seen what's on that route, and you need to go out of your way to find a new one, or you need to look a little bit harder, and you just found out that actually you thought these two were the same exact thing, but they're not. And it's kind of funny, a little story. I went to Rwanda, Africa a few years ago for a study abroad trip, and some kids on my in my group, they weren't environmental science majors, even though it was an environmental science based study abroad course. They were just interested in it. They wanted to go somewhere cool. So they came along, and I was like the crazy bird guy. Like, I brought the Eastern Africa bird book, and I was looking at every single bird I could. I was taking photos of all the birds, and I don't know, I wanted to see as many birds as I could. That was my goal. I wanted to mark every single one down that I saw and try to walk away with 20, 30, 40 different bird species at the end of the trip. And at first, these kids were like, nobody cares, dude. Like, move on. Just have a good time and enjoy the trip. And then at the end, one of them came up to me and they're like, Sam, I can't stop trying to figure out what the different birds are. Like, I can't look at a bird now and not try to know what it is. And it just made me laugh, because I'm like, one person got the bug, and once you start doing it, you can't stop, because you just realize how many there are. You're never going to know them all. You're never going to know every plant or every bird. You might know every animal, because there's, to some level, not that many. But it's just really cool to challenge yourself to, like, learn a new one. And even if it's not every day, if it's one a week, you're still never going to learn them all. And I do run into that mentality sometimes too, where it does feel a little negative to go outside and look at the road ditch on the highway and be like, oh my gosh, what if the road ditches were prairies? What if the boulevards in the center of the highways were prairies? I mean, that's a lot of area that's not being used for much of anything at all. And there are other arguments against it, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but my point is, you look at it from this lens and you're just like, man, these systems have potential that isn't being manifested. And then you look at other systems, and you actually take a second to look at it, and you find that this system that doesn't look very good, or may not look very good to the untrained eye, is actually a lot more complex than you can initially give it credit for. And it's just cool to explore those different dynamics intentionally,
Yeah,
and just kind of seeing what's out there. And then you can, by doing that, I mean, you can make a ton of very basic natural conclusions just off of that information alone.
totally. And that potential in places like roadsides and things is it's only going to manifest. I mean, those are public lands that somewhere the public agreed that, or somebody decided that, fescue would be the roadside grass we would
Yeah.
plant, and then we would mow it regularly. But the degree to which that changes is literally the degree to which the public becomes more aware, or at least interest groups can drive. I mean, who doesn't want showy, wonderful, beautiful roadsides? We've talked about this before, but roadsides themselves, from interstates down to gravel roads and cow paths through fields, they're like fungal mycelia that extracted. I mean, they were literally there because they were extracting resources like fungal mycelia growing through soil. Well, now we can reverse that that process, and start using those to start filling back in with native landscapes, to sort of you know re-establishing where we can. And we've got, I mean, if you lined every road in a landscape with wonderful native wildflowers and grasses, they would start filling in the landscapes in between. They're basically a network for doing that. The only thing stopping us is just public awareness.
I mean, weirdly enough, I'm not even trying to be too negative about it, because not very far from me on the highway, there's actually like an old sign that says wildflowers here, or like native tall grass prairie planting, like in the roadside ditch. But it's all reed canary grass and
Yeah, right.
brome and all this stuff. So it's all invasives now. But I think at some point, obviously we have national parks for a reason, and these native areas for a reason. But at some point there was a push for that sign to get put there. That sign got put there for a reason, and maybe there was some seed thrown out on the side of the road over there. And although it isn't anything now, there's no doubt in my mind that in the seed bank in that spot, there are native plants waiting to come out and show themselves if the right restoration practices were put into place. And I think that is not the only place that's like that. It's just, it needs to be done the right way, and the potential needs to be maximized through the correct methodology depending on the spot.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. I see there's some outside of St. Louis, the signs outside of St. Louis and along the highways will say prairie rehab, and it'll just be weeds and fescue and stuff. And it's like, well, it's like the worst rehab you possibly have.
Take the sign down. It paints the wrong picture.
Yeah, this is not helping anybody at all. But it really becomes a whole separate topic. But just to touch on it briefly, we have this sort of totalitarian understanding of conservation that it's like, okay, there has to be these government agencies and they're in charge of it and they're the ones that should be doing it. And that's not the totalitarian view that the authorities are the ones that are in charge of fixing this. We really have to transcend that mentality and realize that, okay, if you want actual prairie rehabs and prairie roadside plantings and stuff like that, it's going to have to be more like, adopt a highway sort of things, where it's a church or a Boy Scout group says, hey, we're going to do this as a collective group because our community means something to us. You kind of need that dynamic instead of, because I think a lot of people, it's one of the bad things about government being conservation and conservation being government is people just expect them to do it, and that they're paying taxes so they don't have to think about it, when in fact it's never going to work that way.
Well, I'll just put this out there now. This is the first interview of the Living Land podcast. One of these days, the Living Land podcast will adopt a highway section, and we'll do something like that one of these days.
There you go. Yeah.
So it certainly takes a village, and I don't think that this is the only this ain't the only thing that is going to require community effort to maintain and uphold and improve, but I feel like there's a lot of people out there that do care about this kind of stuff, whether they know it or not, whether they know about it or not, whether they've encountered this information in the past. But hopefully through sharing it and talking about it here, we can kind of like spark, I feel like it's a success if we sparked one person to go outside and look at a C value for a plant. If I can get one person to listen to this, go outside in their backyard, figure out what a plant is that they don't know, and look up the C value for it, I would call that a success, because it does not take much to spark that once you do it one time, you're going to do it again. I know you will, and you're just going to keep doing it.
Yeah. You should put the link to the ecological checklist.
I'm going to put the link to the paper, and I have it downloaded. I have the floristic quality database for people to go in as an Excel file. I can share that with anyone. So I literally go onto that Excel sheet every day probably, and I just Control F search a species that I found or that I'm looking for, that I even thought about, that I didn't even see, but I was like, oh, I wonder what red oak is. And I'll just go and look up a red oak, or you can go and look up anything. It's not every single plant species out there, but it's, for the most part, whatever I'm going to find outside, I'm going to find on that paper. And I will put the link in the description somewhere. And if anyone wants to reach out to the podcast, I can share that Excel file. You can go onto the floristic database online and find it as well and download it yourself. But I'm happy to share that with anyone that would want that.
There's even a fun game you can play by using the checklist and the C values. Is get a couple friends together that know enough plants, and then pull plants off the list and have people guess what the C value is. And if they're off by, it's like golf. You want the lowest score possible.
Oh.
So if it's like a 3 and somebody guesses a 4, well, okay, they get a point off. So you just you can go around. It's fun just to guess. I often do it in talks, like of large groups. There's always show pictures. I could show up for a talk on, okay, this talk is supposed to be about prairie restoration in the Midwest. And if I just went through picture after picture of plant and asked people what C values were from the audience, they would have the best presentation. Not related to the subject at all. People just love to sit and look at pictures of plants and guess what the C values are. And it's a fun game to play. And what I've learned from it, with just general audiences even, is how good people are at just that. They relatively know what a species is, even like native just landscape folks. They get really close, very close. A couple exceptions that are always fun is like Rebecca Herta, Black-Eyed Susan. I'll put that one up, and people think it's like a C value, like 4, usually 4 or 5. It's like,
they know it's a native wildflower, but other than that,
right. They're like, oh yeah, I planted that in my garden. That's got to be a good one, and then it breaks their heart to find that it's like a 1.
So I'm doing a quail restoration with my neighbor right now, and that's exactly what happened. I walked his property with him. We were talking about the restoration and what we were going to do, and I introduced C values to him, and I was like, look, man, this is a really cool concept that I'm kind of using as a foundation for our restoration. Like, what we're looking at right now is a low quality system, and I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm saying that because the average C value for the system we're looking at is, honestly, it's 0, because there's nothing there, because it's a field border that we're not planting anymore. So there's literally nothing there right now. But I was like, some of these native wildflowers, I show them, I'm like, these are 0s, these are 1s, these are 2s. And he's like, and it got to the point where he'd be like, what's this? I bet it's like at least a 3. And I'd be like, nah, sorry, man, it's a 1. And he's like, of course it is. And so I put together the seed mix for him for the restoration project. And I put the C values for every seed species. And that was like part of my pitch. I was like, look, man, we're taking this 0 to 1 system, and everything we're planting here is like a 4 or above. And I know that there is some critique to that, and obviously there's a whole nother discussion to be had about the ethics of just shooting for high C values and all of that stuff. But at least, we're adding 50 different seed species to the seed bank here, and at least 45 of the 50 are 4 or above. And so if we get even 5 of them to germinate and establish here, then we basically doubled the mean C value for your planting by just that alone. And although it's a little smudge in the grand scheme of things, it's your property, although 50 acres is still a grain of sand, and the beach that is what we're working with, it's still, improving the quality of that system. And then hopefully in the long term, those will spread seed, and maybe that seed will go into the ditch nearby, and it'll, it's certainly wishful thinking to some level, but at the same time, I like to think at least it's better than nothing.
Yeah, and amplified over the more and more people that do that, because it is fun, and it is, for somebody that has a bunch of zeros and ones to get excited about 5, 6s, and 7s on their property. That is going to enrich their lives in ways that's going to manifest in their family and in their work life, and they're just going to feel better, and they're going to see the flowers, and they're going to feel even better. And then these sort of things that feel good and that are functional in that way will, I think, ultimately spread. It's a very uplifting. I mean,
my favorite part is when people think that a plant is bad, though, and they're like, "Oh man, I hate this. I literally hate this. It needs to go." Yeah. And then they realize that the C value is like kind of high for that plant, and they're like, "Wait a second, what?" Like I was talking to my neighbor about poison ivy, and I'm like, "Poison ivy sucks. We all hate poison ivy, right?" Well, it's a native, and it's like a C value of 3 or 4 or something like that. It's not high. It's not crazy, but by the way, poison ivy is supposed to be here to some level. So killing it off all the time.
Yeah, might be the best plants you have on your property.
It very well could be.
I think poison ivy. Yeah.
I mean, in my field, in my backyard right now, I'm probably growing like a commercial level of poison ivy. If I could figure out a way to make a profit off of growing poison ivy, I mean, I'd make some serious dough. But at the same time, I mean, quail actually use poison ivy, and they'll eat the poison ivy berries, and they'll hide under the poison ivy thickets, because other like coyotes aren't going to go diving into poison ivy after a quail necessarily. So I mean, even some of those species that we think are terrible, wild grape even is a fun one, because that's a native, has ecological potential and provides food for you can even harvest your own grapes from wild grape if you want to. But the point is, even species a lot of people think are weeds and they would get rid of in any normal scenario, once you start to take the C value approach and evaluate it from that lens, you'll be surprised what you'll find.
Yeah, that touches on one of my favorite sort of phenomena that comes out of C values, is that a lot of low C value plants are tangly, thorny, rash inducing, allergy inducing. Ragweed's great example. Like there's a disproportionate amount of weedy, low C value things. There is a function, in the sense that there's a functional element of nature that says this area is off limits. I mean, this area is going to be covered with vines and thorns and nasty poison ivy and ragweed because it's under construction. Leave it alone. They're early successional, and over time, most of those things fade. Poison ivy's kind of a booger, but blackberries fade over time. Ragweed fades over time it's not, but they're always there, right? Like we said a while ago, the average C value is usually right there in the middle because they're always present. It's the proportion to which they're present that restoration ultimately shifts.
Right, and I mean, at the end of the day, this database of plants is almost 3,000 plants long, and over 2,000 of them are the natives, and less than 1,000 of them are the non-natives. So in the grand scheme of things, the biodiversity and available biodiversity is immense, and we really are sitting at a point where like we can do something meaningful and we can restore these native species. We just have to know what we're looking at first, right?
Yeah, and there's no step too small. Put some put some thistles in your garden, and watch the birds go nuts, and to all the way up to volunteer for a local conservation area and help get rid of some invasive species. And there's no end, nothing, no too small an act, no too great an act.
So we're coming to an end here for the first episode, but before we cut it off until the next time, I kind of wanted to throw it back to you. Do you have any parting words for the audience? What would be your one takeaway from this conversation that you hope people hear or take to the next steps? I mean, what is the most important thing somebody could take away from this conversation and impart in their life?
Yeah, one thing I always try to drive home the main message, and try to have as the sort of background hum of most of the things I talk about in nature is, I've been asked, um, what's the most dire thing that we can do? What's the most important thing we can do to help nature, to move conservation forward? Um, and of course, people start thinking invasive species and habitat protection, yada yada yada. And those are all great answers. But to me, the big thing is just the understanding that nature is not a separate thing. Nature is not real. There's no such thing. Nature does not exist. There's just what is, and we are part of this system. And that may not, I mean, we almost have this safety of like, well, we're not, we literally, whether we accept it or not, culturally function in a way that we are separate from it, probably as a way to sort of ignore the bad things we do. And so I think breaking that wall, the reason people don't want to break the wall, they're resistant to realizing that there is no such thing as nature, is because all of a sudden you're swimming in it. It's everywhere. It's everything. It's your cell phone. It's your car. It's there is no separation between you and nature. So break those walls down. It's hard to do because the mind and the psychology and the sociology of your place in the world, very much a lot of your identity depends on your separateness from the rest of existence. And so, it sounds heavy, but it's not that heavy. Start realizing that you're not. And then once you realize you're not, you realize you are engaged in this, in your nervous system. When you hear birds or see wildflowers, that is your nervous system interacting with the nervous systems of other living systems. Embrace that and have good intentions, and then act on your good intentions, and everything else will take care of itself.
And there's nothing wrong with using iNaturalist or PlantNet and those apps that you can literally just take an image and reverse image search to figure out what it is. Because at some point, not everybody is classically trained in botany, and honestly, they're probably more accurate. They're more accurate.
I hate them for how good they are. But I'm blown away, and I'm so enthusiastic about their potential to bring something that would otherwise be unapproachable into people's lives. It's great. I see my grandma, for crying out loud, takes pictures of things and gets correct IDs on groups of plants that I spent my life trying to master through books and field work. So it's beautiful in that sense. So yeah, use those, like Sam, you said it a while ago, just going for a walk. It's good to go for a walk. Go for a walk every now and then. Take your phone, take some pictures of plants, start learning. If you all of a sudden you realize if you really want to see the cool stuff, you got to go somewhere else. And all of a sudden you find yourself in nature preserves, and you're like, oh, I want to bring this closer to home. That's how it starts happening.
Yeah, and it's, if you like plants and you're interested in this kind of thing and you don't have those apps, that should be the first thing you do after listening to this podcast, because once you start doing it, you're never going to not do it. And eventually you won't need it anymore because you'll know them all. But it's going to take some time, and it saves you a lot of effort. I've looked at a lot of those historical books on different wildflowers, and the illustrations are grainy and they're hard to discern from 7 different other types of similar species.
Yeah.
And I don't know how y'all did it back in the day without this information. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Well, that's why only the most passionate of people ever actually became botanists, because you had to just really want it. And and then maybe that's the part that annoys botanists like me, is that you don't have to want it as much as you can get just as far. That's just a personal hang up. It shouldn't be a real thing.
Your
But
job's getting automated though.
yeah,
You're
well, it's totally. But we did a job one time where we put in we collected data in quadrats that they were going to fly over with a drone and try to get the data that we saw in species richness, to be able to take a picture, because they just go over and take pictures and get the same information. So it's almost like training something to do your job for you. Turns out it's more complicated than that. It doesn't actually work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least at the end of the day, we're here now. We have encyclopedias in our pockets, and
Yeah.
we can use that to do something cool. I mean, 50 years ago, we were. I mean, I say we, but y'all and the community of botany were looking at things completely different than what we're looking at now, and looking at it from a different lens. And you guys were trying to solve different problems, and now
Yeah.
today the problems that we're trying to solve are a lot different, because of the information that we have at access to. I
Yeah.
feel like just knowing the problems that we have, and being able to access the information that we have opens up so many doors for exploration and research, and even
It
citizen
does.
science.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, we got no excuses anymore.
yeah, right.
We've got the technology. We should be able to do anything.
I want to give a huge shout out to Justin Thomas for joining me on our first episode of the Living Lands podcast. If you have any questions or comments and would like to reach out, you can find our social media handles in the description of the video, as well as our email address. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to having you listen in on the next one.